Well, hello, Sublation Media viewers, readers, listeners, and commies. It is the Sublation Magazine show. I am Douglas Lain, author of Bash Bash Revolution, contrarian Marxist, recently dubbed Catrone's strongest soldier. And you are?
I'm Ashley Frawley, if you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay, because we were having some technical difficulties, hence the fact that we were starting late. I'm Ashley Frawley, and this is my dog, Marx, who's attached to me today and will be joining us for our live stream. I am Associate Professor of Sociology, Social Policy, and Criminology at Swansea University for a limited time, actually. I will be moving to University of Kent as a visiting researcher in the Centre for Parenting Culture Studies. And I'm the author of various books and articles, and I focus on the medicalization of social problems and all that fun stuff, but we like to talk about politics every Monday and whatever's in the news. Speaking of what's in the news, this week we had the news making news.
I have a whole little prepared rant about the Nazi in the parliament. Which I could jump to, but do you want to go first, Ashley, or shall I?
No, let's start with that because I've had such I don't want to say fun, but I've had such an interesting time doing a deep dive into that whole story because I was in Canada last week. Unfortunately, I was very ill. I was visiting my dad, who's very sick himself, so I could not go anywhere near him, which was really sad. But we were watching the news daily, and my dad watched that, and he said, I didn't even notice it.
Right.
My dad is a smart guy. He watched it live and he was like, yeah, it didn't even register.
Right.
So it's interesting that it didn't register for people who are in politics and who are, quite involved in a conflict, that it did not register in their minds that applauding someone who fought against the Russians in the Second World War might not have been a good guy at the time. But go on, Doug. What was your feeling
okay.
about
Well, there's a comment already. Says, oh, great, another Ukraine bashing anti-freedom rant. Well, we'll see about that. Here's my rant, and I don't know if it's anti-freedom or not. But last week on September 26th, the Speaker of the House of Commons, Anthony Rota, introduced a Ukrainian immigrant to Canada, a 98-year-old man named Yaroslav Hunka. Hunka was hailed as a Ukrainian-Canadian war hero who had fought the Russians in World War II. After the parliament gave him an extended standing ovation, human rights and Jewish groups pointed out that he had, of course, fought as a member of the 14th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS. He was a Nazi. Rhoda had singled out the aged Nazi for praise during a visit from Ukrainian President Zelensky, who was in Canada drumming up support for the Ukrainian war effort. The protests of the parliamentary applause for a Nazi led President Trudeau to apologize. And I'm going to actually show his apology, which I have right here.
Obviously, it's extremely upsetting that this happened. The speaker has acknowledged his mistake and has apologized. But this is something that is deeply embarrassing to the Parliament of Canada and, by extension, to all Canadians. I think particularly of Jewish MPs and all members of the Jewish community across the country who are commemorating Yom Kippur today. I think it's going to be really important that all of us push back against Russian propaganda, Russian disinformation, and continue our steadfast and unequivocal support for Ukraine, as we did last week with announcing further measures to stand with Ukraine.
All right, so what's most significant from my point of view is how Trudeau reflexively and impotently attempted to blame Russian disinformation for the incident, returning to the refrain of needing to stay the course in the war stay the course both in the proxy war in Ukraine, but also, more importantly, perhaps, stay the course in the war on disinformation. In that moment, he was perhaps just as incompetent and foolish as the parliament itself had been when they applauded Hunka. Both errors revealed too much. After all, the war on disinformation is premised on lies and hoaxes that were cooked up by both the Clinton campaign and the U.S. security state. The recent Durham report made clear that the allegations of collusion with Russia that were leveled against former President Donald Trump were entirely fabricated, and that a competent FBI would not have started a formal investigation into the presidency based on the clearly fraudulent evidence presented to the agency. In fact, the FBI was informed that the Clinton campaign intended to use the FBI in its effort to gain the presidency even before the Steele dossier was presented to the FBI. And that Steele dossier contained the P-tape allegations. It was a fiction written up at the request of the Clinton campaign. Even the evidence that Russians hacked into the DNC servers and provided WikiLeaks with the emails that were so consequential to Clinton's 2016 campaign, so detrimental to that campaign, is now in doubt. Recent FOIA requests revealed that the same academic researchers who purposely concocted the Alpha server hoax, that's the story that a server in Trump Tower was in regular communication with a server for Alpha Bank in Moscow, were responsible for providing the supposed evidence of a Russian hack of the DNC. Further, it is known that the Biden campaign orchestrated the drafting of a letter signed by 50 intelligence officials that claimed that the Hunter Biden laptop leak had all the classic earmarks of a Russian information operation. This letter was used to discredit the story during the campaign. It has also been revealed that the FBI met with mainstream and social media company reporters and executives months before the Hunter Biden laptop information was revealed to the media. In a tabletop exercise run by the Aspen Institute, the FBI trained media professionals on how to handle a story that had the earmarks of Russian disinformation. They trained the media on how to suppress the story. The hypothetical Russian disinformation used as an example in the exercise was the release of Hunter Biden's laptop. So to place Trudeau's statement in full context, we must also recall that the Department of Homeland Security used the Russian effort to interfere in the 2016 election, this Russian disinformation hoax, as a justification to extend the agency's jurisdiction. Specifically, all U.S. communications infrastructure were placed into the hands of the Department of Homeland Security, and through CISA, which is an agency under the Department of Homeland Security, a network of NGOs and billionaire and state-funded nonprofits were tasked with evaluating and controlling all communication on social media. The Election Integrity Partnership, an NGO connected to Stanford University's Internet Observatory, and the Virality Project were revealed to have censored social media posts on the topics of election fraud and on COVID policies and criticisms of COVID policies. The Virality Project was, amongst other things, tasked with suppressing all criticism of Anthony Fauci. Fear of the nearly entirely fictional threat of Russian disinformation is used to shut down all criticism of the current neoliberal order, both within the United States and within other NATO countries. Last week, Trudeau attempted to use fear of Russian disinformation to excuse or deflect from not only the embarrassing ovation Hunka received in Parliament, but also the more consequential reality that the United States and NATO are providing weapons to literal Nazi forces in Ukraine. What does it mean for the U.S. and Canadian citizens that our countries are relying on Nazis to fight in Ukraine? How can the neoliberal order continue to use the fear of right-wing reaction to justify its own authoritarian rule today? So that's what I have written down. That's my opening salvo, my anti-freedom rant. What do you think?
Well, I had a whole deep dive history into the 14th Regiment.
Well, go ahead.
The whole history. No, but that okay. So I want to spend some time on this. So what you're saying is that this whole idea of Russian disinformation is being obviously used as this free for all, basically get out of jail free card every time something embarrassing happens for governments, right?
Mm-hmm.
But nobody believed that, did they? I mean, everyone was like, "Oh my God, Trudeau, really?" I mean, did anybody buy that for half a second? So
no,
I mean,
no, I don't think they did. But my point is just that both the applause for the Nazi and his reflexive use of the excuse of Russian disinformation gave the game away. Like, this was a moment where it ought to now be revealed that neither the war in Ukraine nor the war on disinformation are justified in terms of protecting democracy or standing up for freedom or pushing against right-wing reaction. The entire story about Russian disinformation and the war on disinformation, the narratives that support that war are lies. They are themselves, not I hate to use the term, but they are themselves based on disinformation. So that's now been and the hollowness of that move is revealed now. I think that would be my point.
I mean, I think it was revealed personally. I mean, maybe it's because I sit and I listen to you tell me about it every week, Doug. But I think it was revealed a long time ago personally, so that when I heard that, and even my dad, who I don't think minds Trudeau that much, I'm not sure if he does actually, thought it was quite a cynical maneuver, just as like a passive observer. I mean, I thought it was quite clearly very, very cynical. But why do you think he felt he could get away with this when it seemed so obvious? Like, what an embarrassing thing happened. You didn't know your history. You're so historically illiterate. It's an obviously Orwellian moment because we've always been at war with Russia. Why would he think that the Canadian public or the world could be so easily fooled? They're just so used to getting away with it. It just works. It's a line that works. You used to just say Russian disinformation and suddenly you're transported elsewhere, like, clicking your heels in in the Wizard of Oz.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, basically, he has been treating politics like a video game. So I just pressed the Russian disinformation button, because it usually works. Also, I think it was a kind of a panicked moment. I don't think he was fully briefed and had all of his ducks in a row when he made that statement. But what I would say is, sure, people on the dissident left, let's say, people who have been critical of the Russiagate story, maybe from early days, or certainly since the Durham report, might have already seen through the war on disinformation and not be afraid of Russian disinformation today. But I think that there are quite a few center to left progressives who still are committed to both the Russiagate story, actually, and even more so to the project of the war on disinformation, and by extension, they're committed to an uncritical effort to support the Ukrainian side of that conflict, which I think we should be. I want to be careful. I don't want to, be seen as not supporting Ukrainian sovereignty, but I also want there to be some sort of resolution and peaceful negotiation of an end to the conflict, which could have happened. The conflict could have been avoided from the start if NATO had been willing to assure Putin that Ukraine would not become a member of NATO, and after the conflict began, there was a negotiated settlement which Zelensky was prepared to sign, that Boris Johnson and NATO rejected. So we've had at least two opportunities to end the conflict peacefully. We meaning the NATO West, and we have rejected those opportunities. We're not interested.
No, Doug, those are Putin talking points. No, no.
I know this is you got it. No, keep up the war on disinformation. I'm clearly compromised.
No, I mean, there's nothing that you can say contra the lines repeated everywhere that will not get you utterly piled on as you're just repeating Putin talking points, et cetera, et cetera. And if we had given in even an inch, then Putin's imperialist ambitions would have run amok, et cetera. And if you want to hear counter arguments to that, you can head over to my channel at Ashley A. Frawley, where I interview Thomas Fadzi about what he thinks this war is really about and who wants to stay at war. And there's a hint in the thumbnail: behind Ukraine is an American flag. So there are obviously and we've been talking about this for years, that there are enormous push factors towards staying at war. And personally, and I'm just going to get, whatever, everybody just pile on me, I don't care. I think the phenomena that lead to these kinds of conflicts are, to a certain extent, epiphenomena. They're the sort of above what are deeper grinding processes that lead us irresistibly toward a continuing conflict. And one of these is obviously the falling rate of profit. But you can't just go directly there. Nobody says the rate of profit is falling. Oh no, we'd better go to war. But as you have dwindling areas for profitable investment, it becomes more and more of a powerful push. The famous phrase is, if you can't build bridges, if you can't use steel to build bridges, use it to make bullets. And this is what winds up happening. And we've been calling it for many, many years. And you'll say, "Oh, you Marxists, you think you predict what's the famous line? 10 out of every 5 crises." I think the number changes every time I quote.
Yeah, like 100 out of 1 out of every 100 predicted crises we get right, or something like that.
Yeah.
But anyway,
no, we're constantly predicting war and constantly predicting crisis, but because there's an underlying trend within capitalism. But anyways, everybody has heard this narrative from me before, and we want to talk about what happened in Parliament. So the first obvious point to make is, well, I don't think it's an obvious point. Thank you for making a good point, Doug, that there was a deflection activity that happened there that was incredibly cynical and just unbelievably silly, that Trudeau tried to deflect onto Russian disinfo, and thought he could apparently get away with it, because it seems to me that that's their get out of jail free card. So that's the first point. The second one is a very obvious point. How fucking Orwellian was the fact that any of that even happened. Like, as soon as I didn't watch it live. I said my dad was watching it, but we were watching the news later, and my dad was like, "Oh crap, I didn't even think about it." And I was like, the moment that they started, I heard the guy say, the speakers, they were playing the clip back. He paused too, like he almost had a moment of self-awareness, where he was like, fought against the Russians. And then he kept talking, where he almost realized, like, wait a second, the Russians were on our side in World War II. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that because you fought against the Russians, you were necessarily a Nazi, and I'll get into that in a moment. But that sent alarm bells off, where I was like, have we rewritten history to such an extent that we have forgotten, okay, say what you will about the USSR, but we have completely forgotten their role in ultimately defeating fascism, that's just been written off, that we've always, and I know people are going to comment, but they made a pact with the Nazis in 1939, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, but in the end, there was such a how many freaking Russians died fighting fascism? That's just completely written off. And it's like our historical memory is so completely altered that it was as though the Russians were the Nazis in the Second World War. That the Russians were quite clearly like the evil that we have always been fighting.
Right. I mean, and not only is that like maybe a mistake or a kind of thinking that's prevails amongst the unwashed masses, but probably much more likely to prevail in the Canadian Parliament. I mean, clearly, no one even paused for a moment before giving him an extended standing ovation. So
I know I looked for any blinks of awareness in the whole crowd, and there was just nothing there.
Yeah, right.
So it was, yeah. So the very fact that happened speaks to an incredible historical amnesia. And I know the word Orwellian is overused, and it is overused, but I mean, this whole, like, we've always been at war struck me as just astounding. Okay. Then the other thing was, so I go and I'm reading about it online, and people all these revelations are coming up, and people are, obviously hunting him down on the internet to find out more information about this. So it's all over Twitter. And the major news agencies are tweeting that, like, this has happened. And the comments underneath are all like, okay, but, how much of a Nazi was he really? It was a difficult time. And it was complex. The situation was complex. And it was complex. I'll tell you so. However, I just found that hilarious, because in our political climate, everyone's a literal Nazi except a fucking Waffen-SS like member. That it's like, well, let's bring in some nuance here. But like gender critical women are fucking fascists, you know. So all right, let's bring in a little bit of nuance.
Okay.
It is okay. So do you know the history of Ukrainian Canadians and so on?
No, you tell me.
Okay, so I don't know how far back to go here. Yes, the situation was complex. And a blog post that, I'm not sure how to say his name correctly, Hunka, wrote about 10, 12 years ago, I think it was from 2011, has been circulating, and the National Post has written about it and sort of summarized it, and I've read it myself. And it's disturbing. It's disturbing reading. Doug, did you read the blog post that was being sent around?
No, I was too busy ranting. You fill me in.
So I do recommend that others have a look at the National Post summary of it, because I read it when it was circulating on Twitter, and that was basically my impression as well. And I think they do a very good job of summing up what makes such uneasy reading. So he talks about how what was it? I think it begins in 1939. He's very young, and he witnesses this sort of takeover and this fear of the USSR coming, and people begin slowly as time goes on. His life sort of changes. He has this lovely teacher that taught him Russian. And one day that teacher was basically disappeared to a labor camp in Siberia. He finds out later that his some family members were also disappeared, that it is implied, I'm not sure if he says, I can't remember, but that they had died. And so there's this enormous fear of the USSR that's brewing in his homeland. And in that context, the Germans seemed like the lesser evil. So they had a Sophie's choice there. There was a growing kind of nationalism that was developing, a kind of Ukrainian nationalism, a desire for independence against this force that was coming in from the outside. And it seemed like the Germans were like a friendly face in relation to that. Now he kind of says, like, they realized as time went on that they weren't. But the division that he was in was a volunteer division, and a lot of Ukrainians joined partisan forces. It's not like he was forced to do it. He willingly joined up. And he then he alludes to some Jews, some Jewish refugees. But what seems, and this is what the National Post points out, he is so heartfelt when he talks about his own country's loss of independence and the things that happened to him. But he's quiet, disturbingly quiet, about why those Jewish refugees were there, what happened to them. And the fact that a huge part of the propaganda surrounding the volunteer regiments was around having a racially pure homeland. And it's very difficult to imagine. Like, Heinrich Himmler gave a speech for his regiment in which he very clearly said, "We've done you a great service by ridding your homeland of Jews." It's unthinkable that he didn't hear that. There was a propaganda magazine for that regiment which carried strong anti-Jewish sentiments. It's unthinkable he wasn't aware of that. And yet he doesn't talk about it. He doesn't talk about it at all. And the National Post calls this a kind of blind spot that happens with these kind of nationalist movements. They have an extreme sense of their own longing and loss, and a blind spot for that of others. So he joined this regiment willingly. He describes it as the best years of his life. And now here's where the controversy comes in. So,
now that we get to the controversy, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, because we don't know exactly what he was involved in. The regiment is accused of a massacre of a Polish village. I think now historical sources are uncertain. Some say 500, some say several hundred, some say up to 1,000. people were murdered in this village. They rounded the people up, put them in a barn and set fire to the barn and burned them alive, like really horrible things. And that was his regiment. And then lesser known, there's a number of papers. Historians have been arguing about this whole thing for decades. I went through some of the papers, and one of them was on Slovakia, and the regiment's tour in Slovakia, and the atrocities that were allegedly committed there. So there's a lot of bad stuff that probably went down. Now, where there's uncertainty is exactly what happened and whether, who exactly was involved in these things. So, because after the war, the regiment wound up surrendering. Well, during the war, they surrendered to British troops. They went to Italy to POW camps, and then they were eventually transported to the UK. And from the UK, so he married his wife in 1951, who was British. And there was limited kind of screening that happened. Like, it seemed like Canada didn't give a shit, to be honest. Like, and one of the things that the Jewish groups are really mad about is that Canada famously turned away a ship carrying Jewish refugees during the Second World War. I think a third of the people that were on that ship were eventually killed in concentration camps. But after the war, they welcomed with open arms people who had fought on the side of the Nazis at the very least. And there was some allegations in the 80s that they had let in Himmler, I'm pretty sure. It turned out that wasn't the case. I think that was it Himmler? I'm possibly mixing that. But anyways, no, not Himmler. I'm not talking about the doctor.
Yeah.
Famous. Yeah.
Yeah, I've forgotten his name too at the moment, but
anyways, like that they had let in. I know I'm mixing up the days that these people
died
as well. Yes.
Joseph.
So yeah, so I think that's it. But anyway, some famous Nazis that they had allowed in, there were allegations of that. It turned out that that wasn't the case, but they had been pretty lax, and there were about 8,000. So there were 8,000 members of this regiment that they allowed in to Canada, among tens of thousands of Ukrainians. And there was a general feeling at the time that these people had been Nazi sympathizers. And so there was a push to kind of screen them, and and Canada kind of half-assedly screened some of them, but let everybody in. And the conclusion of reports that eventually emerged was that, look, these people fought on the side of Nazis, but really it was for a nationalist cause, and they probably didn't do anything, and nothing's provable anyway, and so they just kind of let them in. And yeah, I mean, they were a lot more lax about letting Nazis in than they were about letting Jews in, which is really, really disturbing. And I can understand why Jewish groups are really mad about that. So the controversy is surrounding exactly to what degree he himself was complicit in crimes associated with his regiment, to what extent he himself subscribed to Nazi ideology. The volunteers who joined this regiment did have to swear an oath to Hitler, and you can see pictures of them giving Nazi salutes and so on. Again, it was a complicated time. It was. You do need historical. You do need some nuance here. That they were presented with an impossible choice, and they made the choice to side with the Germans. And
right,
but
and those Nazi.
And
go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you say
it. Those Nazi forces are still in Ukraine. There are still nationalist Nazis fighting against the Russian invasion, which is the kernel of truth behind Putin's claims that part of the reason for the invasion is the denazification of Ukraine. A few years ago, when Zelensky was attempting to negotiate a peaceful coexistence with Russia and abide by the Minsky Accords or the ceasefire, he went to visit these hardened Nazi battalions within the Ukrainian military and asked them to put down their weapons and disarm, and was told no. there's a quote from him saying, like, I'm not some loser. I'm the president of Ukraine. You have to listen to me. And they did not. So this faction has its own base within Ukraine at the border there. And we are arming a very dangerous group of people. It's the same as arming the Mujahideen during the occupation of Afghanistan. It's creating, strengthening deeply reactionary forces within the region, giving Nazis the, whether or not they're exactly identical to the German Nazis of World War II or have evolved since then in some way, like it's the new KKK. Nonetheless, it's a deeply reactionary, ethnocentric Ukrainian Nazi militia group in Ukraine that is getting drones and, I don't know, irradiated shells and so forth. They're being given the highest tech, the most advanced weaponry that we're willing to part with in this effort anyhow. So it's worth noting the way in which we're setting up reaction and to be a more powerful force in the region as we arm Ukraine.
I mean, we're no stranger to doing this, right? That's kind of whoever's there will do it. But I mean, are you not risking kind of playing into the propaganda that surrounds why this is happening? That there are dark forces that need to be sort of flushed out of Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera.
During the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, and of Iraq, I would not have wanted to claim that Saddam Hussein was a progressive fighter for democracy against Western imperialism, nor would I have wanted to support the Taliban as anything but a force for a reactionary force within the region. And yet I would also not have justified in any way the invasion either Afghanistan or Iraq. I don't believe that by pointing to the facts in Ukraine that I am justifying the illegal invasion and attempted occupation of Ukraine by Russian forces.
But I think that I think part of the reason why people were looking for the nuance is that they knew that there was a legitimate issue of sovereignty in Ukraine then as well. And, there is a legitimate issue of sovereignty in Ukraine. And that's taken really morbid forms. I don't know, maybe in the absence of something, I'm just trying to play devil's advocate here, like trying to maybe put these small numbers of people in context that, people are being faced with impossible choices. And there are some people who maybe feel very strongly about, as I said, morbid ideologies, but the vast majority of people in Ukraine feel strongly about their own sovereignty. And that's a kind of a really, really difficult question.
There are legitimate questions of sovereignty in Spain right now, as they're members of the EU. There were legitimate questions of sovereignty in the UK, which presaged Brexit. There are the problems of national sovereignty within the context of a global capitalist economy, arises in lots of different forms, and so not every struggle for sovereignty, national sovereignty, or national identity is the same, and no nation can stand apart from the rest of the world today and be self-sufficient and innocent, entirely. So, and certainly Ukraine was not seeking true independence on the level that these Nazis would probably dream of, but rather to be not only brought into as a NATO nation, but also to be brought into the EU, and to become part of Europe, which would make Ukraine, in a way that might have been beneficial, much more porous and filled with all sorts of different kinds of people. So, I don't. Go ahead.
No, sorry. Finish your thought.
So yeah, I mean, obviously that's different from being a member state of the EU. Is not the same as being occupied by a foreign army, but questions of sovereignty arise on lots of different levels all the time. And and if you don't support the occupation of Ukraine, if you don't support the invasion of Ukraine, you are recognizing Ukrainian sovereignty. But that doesn't mean you have to side with the Ukrainian struggle against the Russians during World War II. Obviously, you know what I mean? Like, obviously, in that moment, that was to side with the most reactionary forces that at least that most people can think of, from human history. So
here's where I think that the underlying kind of racial ideology probably played a role. This idea of an ethnically pure kind of homeland. It can't be separated from why a lot of these people decided to take that side. And these were the explicit promises, because now someone will probably comment, these people could not be Nazis because they were not racially, they were Slavs, which is true. And it was very opportunistic on the part of, and they were not opportunistic, desperate. It was out of desperation that they formed these battalions. I don't know if that's the right word, but that they formed this regiment anyway, because they were losing and they needed somebody on that side, and they decided organizing Ukrainians to fight on that front was going to be beneficial to them. And then they sort of made these promises that fit in with, I think, a pre-existing ideology of a racially pure homeland. And this is what Himmler referred to in his speech. He said, "We have done you a favor by cleansing your country, your homeland, of this scourge that was the Jews." And there was a lot of animosity for a really long time, which I think is really interesting. A lot of animosity between Ukrainian and Polish people that seems to have all been forgiven now because they've got like a common enemy. But for what happened in World War II, for the massacre of Polish people, but also there was, I mean, the more that you look into it, the more it was just like, I don't want to say you can understand, because it's not understandable, because obviously a lot of people joined the partisans, a lot of people fought against the fascists and so on. But it was the thing to do at the time, was to ethnically cleanse. Like, everybody's fucking ethnically cleansing. And so there was just this endless retaliation. Just it was tit for tat constantly. And so this is what people were getting at when they were saying, like, it was a different time. And why they probably didn't feel that bad, didn't feel a pang of remorse, because, well, when they were justifying the Polish massacre of the liquidation of that village, they were like, well, they killed some of our soldiers and they were harboring the enemy. And this was one of the, if you look at the historians who've gone through all of the literature and all of the notes and all of the reports that were being sent back and forth at the time, this is how people justified it. They were saying, well, it's unfortunate, but sometimes civilians get caught in the mix.
Over the weekend, I was working on creating an audio book for a future title from Deflection called How We Got Here. And it has a longer title than that. And in the beginning of the book, there are some segments about Thomas Aquinas and the history of reason, and how Aristotelian reason made its way through the Catholic Church and all that. And I was sort of reading the history around Aquinas to add to an audio tour version of the book. And so this is why I'm bringing it up right now, is because during the time of the Holy Roman Empire, there were many moments where nationalist sentiments would take hold within the Holy Roman Empire, and it was always or often it was a competition between the authority of the Catholic Church as opposed to the relatively more secular, although not at all secular, authority of the emperors in Germany. Right, so there was a political order, and then there was a religious order, and they were in conflict over who would have the true authority, who would collect the taxes and things like that. And there was like a movement, I think, in the late 12th century to break from Rome and from the Catholic Church, and the motto was, German money for a German church. So I wouldn't look back on that and want to take sides over, like, was I for the Catholic hierarchy, and for papal authority, or was I for the German emperors and the nationalist sentiment that was taking hold in the 12th century? So not every struggle for nationalist for a national identity and for sovereignty and German money for a German church is, in any way emancipatory or progressive. And what distinguishes, bourgeois movements for national sovereignty from those earlier iterations of nationalism, I think, would be the degree to which they came along with a constitutional, democratic form of authority, which would empower working class and bourgeois people rather than emperors and kings. And today we should ask, to what degree do struggles for national sovereignty break from the oligarchies and other forms of authoritarian power in the world and set up the people of those nations to have more authority and political opportunities in their own lives. I mean, we're not always going to be able to judge that particularly well from afar, but it is, I think, a good rule of thumb as to whether or not you are going to support some nationalist struggle or not. And I would say, a Ukraine that sided with the Nazis, unlikely to be headed for, a democratic liberal republicanism after. So.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the comments that people had made, where it was like, okay, it might have been understandable that they were presented with an impossible choice, but somehow the solution was an authoritarian state under an ethnically pure, or a pure ethno state. Like, that was ruling over an authoritarian state ruling over an ethnically pure ethno state. So, it doesn't, because there were real problems, it doesn't follow that that was the solution. Do you know what I mean? So, and that was that was ultimately chosen by at least these people, not everybody, I should say, by any stretch. And it was an issue that the Ukrainians that came were seen as Nazi sympathizers. But part of the reason why they didn't want to return is because, and this is what the controversy that sort of came up years after the Ukrainians were let into Canada was about, was they didn't want to go back to Ukraine, not only because they didn't want to go back to, the rule of the USSR, but also because they had done terrible things during the war and they knew that. So there was like this uncertainty surrounding, do we welcome these people during the Cold War who are now on our side because we're now against the Soviets, versus are these people here because they can't go back knowing what they've done? So this was an issue. But what you're talking about around sovereignty and supporting that battle, I think is so important, because what has happened is that the sovereign will of the people within a nation state, being the main way in which democracy is expressed today, is so lost. It's now being completely bequeathed to the right. So it becomes a right-wing issue. And then it gets translated into all the forms that the right wants it to take. And it will take these kinds of extreme forms as well. Not everything that's on the right is necessarily extreme, but we've completely bequeathed sovereignty to the right. And this, I think, is a really big issue. It's a difficulty for us, because I do understand, and I think it's a persistent difficulty for decades. That how do you have like a socialist revolution that respects the will of sovereign states? You had a socialist revolution that did not respect the will of sovereign states, and that came as and was perceived by many people in these countries, if not the majority, as a foreign power that was using them, crushing them, responsible for huge numbers of deaths and so on in service of some grand project. And this is what Hannah Arendt talks about when she talks about totalitarianism, that the most horrible thing that came out of the Second World War was this understanding, this realization that everything is possible, or this belief that everything is possible, that everything that exists is simply an impediment that can be taken away at will, right? That whole groups of people can be just disappeared in service of some greater good. And I think that's a persistent problem for socialism as well, that you can see everything as simply an impediment to some greater cause and do a lot more evil. So we have this sovereignty difficulty ourselves. And I felt like when I was reading his Hunka's memoir, I suppose you could call it, that blog post, I did feel like a pang of sympathy for him when he was describing the people that showed up with the red stars on their cap, and that they were this foreign aggressor, and that they had, sent people away. All that exists is simply an impediment that can be done away with at will. All the people that were there, the talk that existed in the town, they were able to speak freely and suddenly they couldn't. It was all whispers, everybody watching each other, people being disappeared. In that context, the Germans appeared to be a lesser evil because then they could speak freely after the Germans came. And I'm not saying that I'm sympathizing with the Nazis, but I can understand what it's like to have this foreign aggressor, and that things becoming so polarized now that,
they can speak freely as long as they didn't say, "What are you doing to the Jews?"
Yeah.
They could speak freely as long as
they could speak freely as long as there was no reason not to speak freely, right? Were there any areas of disagreement? Sorry, now I've lost my train of thought.
Sorry, I interrupted you, but I want to kind of.
Oh no, I was trying to say. Sorry, I was trying to say about polarization, that as soon as something is like seen to be owned by the right, we're like, oh, that's a right-wing issue, right? And then we don't really deal deeply enough with why we have a problem with that. So, freedom. You're talking about freedom. You sound like a right-winger, instead of being like, why does freedom now belong to them? What kind of freedom are we talking about? And how do we hold on to freedom and emancipation without? And what does that mean for us? We're just like, nope, that's theirs. Sovereignty. Nope, that's theirs. And then you then fall back into these what we've always been criticized for as socialists, and we just kind of accept that as, well, that's just what socialists do. No, we have to learn from them.
I think I've told this anecdote a few times on the channel before, but back in the early days of the 21st century, during the lead up into the war in Iraq, I was involved with the peace movement, and I showed up at a rally with a sign that said "Freedom, not war." And I was at that time very concerned about the way the war effort was turning into an excuse to attack the domestic population and roll back civil liberties here at home through things like the Patriot Act. And so I wrote this slogan on a sign and brought it to the protest. And a member of Socialist Action, which is an organization I knew, I was kind of a fellow traveler alongside, a guy named Gary came up to me and said, "Listen, Doug, I understand what you mean, but you can't say that because freedom in most people's mind just means American libertarianism. And so, that's just not going to land. That doesn't mean what you think it means. It's a confused message." And I didn't agree with him then, but now looking back on that, I just find it incredibly sad that a Marxist would tell me, a socialist Trotskyist Marxist would tell me you can't hold up a sign at the moment that the Patriot Act is passed that says freedom, not war. But
Yeah.
to go back to just one other pass or back around here to my rant at the beginning, from the point of view of a Canadian or an American, I guess Canada is technically American. You know what I mean? The point is, from someone in North America, asking ourselves, well, how bad of a Nazi was this guy? And can we try to understand his point of view? I think, is as good bleeding heart leftists, I can see the impulse, but and I can see why that might be worth doing, and especially worth doing if we're going to use it as a way to tackle a deeper problem around nationalism and sovereignty. But the first thing we should do is realize that Justin Trudeau and Joe Biden and the neoliberal establishment have no claim, can no longer make any claim to be forces standing firm against right-wing reaction. We have to, and a lesson we should have learned multiple times over the last half century, that the established authorities within the West continually, again and again, opportunistically support at best right-wing reaction, and they can do it in the name of just about any value, liberal democracy, freedom, what have you. And is the left's job, the socialist left's job, is to note that and to try to organize a political force that could actually not fall into these opportunistic traps, or at least understand the struggle for change, political change, to be something done out of something more than just naked self-interest of a ruling class. Like this is it seems to me that, especially since 2016, the good neoliberals standing up against populist reaction have demonstrated the extent to which they're willing to overturn every value that distinguishes populist reaction from liberal bourgeois democracy. And once they've done that, I don't see how. I mean, not we can in any way choose them as the lesser evil. They are not. And they are not the lesser evil in this moment. They've just applauded a literal Nazi in the Canadian Parliament. And we've been told that we're closer to a nuclear annihilation today than we've been since the 60s, since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it came out of, in a way, it didn't come out of nowhere at all. In reality, it didn't come out of nowhere. But it was not the conflict with Russia in the United States, the risks involved in Ukraine were not made political issues during campaigns. This was not something that we were made to understand was on the table, that's something that was going on, that the U.S. public needed to be engaged with. It was, the question was whether or not the supply chains would shut down, or COVID, or a dozen different failed policies and crises were put before us instead. But the return of a nuclear threat, it should absolutely be unacceptable. It indicates the complete failure of the West after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that this is still hanging over our heads, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and it's even more of an issue in the UK, where we have a prime minister that was not elected, Rishi Sunak. He was not elected to lead the party. He was chosen within his own party, and the election was won on Brexit, right? And now you have decisions being made to step up in a really serious way, British involvement, completely without any kind of democratic input. And I was like, the discourse surrounding these announcements about British sort of really making enormous enormous inputs, additional inputs that are direct aggression between the UK and Russia. People are like, well, we're fucking getting nuked. Like, you know, and that was it, right? And this was not something that people had decided. And that's extremely, extremely disturbing. And I wanted to point out as well, the discussion in our comments, are sort of the people watching live is really interesting and really, really good. And there's so much that's been coming up and I've not been able to read. I put some up on the screen. Someone said that Arendt is problematic. Arendt's critique of totalitarianism and her tendency to kind of equate everything with Stalinism. Yeah, I do find Arendt's understanding of totalitarianism, I don't know, unconvincing in a lot of ways, but I think she's a great critic, and I think some of her critiques do give us pause, and we do need to think about that. Like, you know, you take Arendt's critique of like everything is possible, and you combine that with the image of the people showing up in Ukraine with the red stars on their hat, sending people off to Siberia, and it does give you pause. It's really fucking scary, and we don't want to repeat that. Right? We don't want to repeat that and encourage this people to think that the lesser evil is fucking Nazi Germany. Right?
Right.
You know, that's terrifying. And who knows, you know, maybe that's a possibility again, or at least a farcical possibility. That
I guess my
version of itself is feeding into a insane reaction.
My reaction to Arndt's critique of Stalinism or fascism as a utopian project that dreams that everything is possible would be to say everything is possible except for the overcoming of the authority of the state. Everything is possible except for the emancipation of humanity. Everything is possible except for the full realization of the human beings who are actually in the world. So what's possible is murder or imprisonment or the disposal of our enemies. Any enemy can be overcome by the power of this technocratic state. It dreams, but it can't overcome its own contradictions. That's no longer possible. They can't realize its own values. That's not possible. And I think right now we're in this moment where the project of realizing those values has been suppressed. Recently, it's been suppressed in the defeat of the Sanders campaign, but also it was suppressed in order to back the Sanders campaign. You know, to move to Sanders was a suppression of the attempt to realize those values, and then it was that half effort was also suppressed and defeated. So we're in a very bad moment as leftists. We may not be, something I want to talk about in the parrot room is we may not be in as bad a moment, despite my fears of nuclear Armageddon overall, like in the United States, say. Like I'm curious. I've been reading people who are Democrats claiming that Biden's economy is really great and that there's been that has been a very progressive administration and successful on its own terms. That the unemployment rate is low, that inflation is dropping, that you'll love this, the reported levels of happiness are higher than ever. And yet somehow Biden is still tremendously unpopular. And so Democrats are scratching their heads like the economy's great. Everyone's happy by our metric. And yet they don't like Biden. So maybe we can talk about that.
Yeah. Oh, okay. All right. I just want to make a note of that. To what extent is the economy great? Okay. But before we move to the parrot room, I wanted to give one further aspect of context why the people in Parliament were applauding very stupidly. Is that after, and it began right at the end of the war, even that regiment became whitewashed is the word that historians use, or historians that are critical of the regiment use, to be entirely a Ukrainian nationalist regiment that had nothing really to do with the Nazis. The regiment itself was renamed several times, at least 5 or 6 times by my count. And the last renaming was to rename it a regiment of the Ukrainian National Army, which they had refused to do before that. and that was the last renaming. And so there are a number of monuments in Canada that have been erected by the survivors of this regiment in memory of the Ukrainian fight for independence, that periodically get defaced by what do you call it? What is it called? Spray paint.
Antifa? Oh, yeah. Oh, spray paint. Yeah.
Yeah, spray paint. Writing things like literal Nazis, actual Nazis on the monument. But that was part of a campaign to kind of rehabilitate the image of these soldiers as primarily freedom fighters for Ukraine. And as I've told you, it is not that simple. But that is what the legacy that they have fought for since that time. So that is why the people in Parliament didn't think much of it, possibly. I mean, being nice to them. They're probably just totally fucking historically illiterate. But in the nicest possible reading, it's because the legacy has been successfully rehabilitated to be entirely about the fight for Ukrainian independence.
Yeah. Well,
sorry, one of the comments
to think otherwise is to fall for Putin's, disinformation. If you break from that understanding, you're just using Putin's talking points at that point. Go ahead.
But so there's a few more points that I want to make about that, but let's go over to the parrot room.
Okay. Yeah, and also I want to say in the parrot room, I want to discuss my recent appearance on This is Revolution with Gene Bajalan. He messaged me this morning through Facebook saying some of his listeners wrote to him, or one of his listeners wrote to him, accusing him of having bullied me during that interview, which I was disappointed to hear, because if I looked like I was being bullied, that meant I didn't do as well as I thought I did in making my side of the argument the stronger argument. But we can discuss that, and we'll see everyone.
Crying halfway through the interview, Doug.
But it was about something else. It wasn't because of anything he said. I remembered a sad moment. Okay. Anyhow, I will let's put up a link to the parrot room. We'll start in about 5 to 10 minutes. We'll start the next stream, and you'll see it in the link to it in the comments. Please do sign up. Patreon support is really important to us, and as we enter what is, I think, coming up on our 3rd year at Deflection, something like that. Maybe I'm losing track of time, but anyway, please. 2nd year. Okay, that's right, 2nd year. And we will, we'll see you all over there. Please do join in on the Parrot Room Patreon discussions, and we will be more responsive to comments there. So, okay, I'll go to this little button, and we'll see you.